Yeah. So yes, again, as I said, it's supposed to be a very informal conversation. A few people have left, and we'll be back in half an hour. But the idea was to invite you, especially, given the fact that you have been navigating both fields, like Vic as well. I think my story is a bit more complicated because I come from philosophy.
Mm.
Now I was in a political science department, and now I'm applying for tenure in history. And so the idea was just to have a very informal conversation about
Great.
your path. If you can
Very
start,
happy to join you. Yeah.
yeah, no, if you can start by telling us a little bit more, perhaps, about your experience from your undergrad studies to your PhD and now your position at Cambridge.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here, and thanks for everyone who's going to be listening in either now or on the recorded version. So my route to where I am now is a fairly winding one in disciplinary terms, although in institutional terms, it's a pretty conventional one. So I was an undergraduate at King's College London. Studied war studies, which is quite a unique name. Basically, an international relations kind of program with a focus on security and conflict. So, lots of courses there, mainly in politics and IR, but a couple in philosophy, a couple in kind of English literature, looking at representations of war, that sort of stuff. So, not exactly interdisciplinary, but covering lots of different approaches to the study of society and politics, which I guess it's a way that I've continued to work in various ways. I went from there to a master's degree in international relations at Cambridge, and in one sense, haven't really left. So IR again, crossing various subfields and disciplines. My main interest at the time, I guess, was in sort of social theory within IR. So quite popular approach to studying IR in Britain, at least. I did a little bit of intellectual history on the course, but not much. So still really hadn't had a sort of disciplinary grounding. Still this kind of variety of different approaches to study of politics. And then I moved into the PhD program at Cambridge with the intention of continuing to work on the same topic that I'd been doing my MPhil on, which was more specifically on chaos and complexity theory in international relations, which in the late 90s, early 2000s, roughly when I was reading this kind of stuff, was pretty popular. And I realized after a year or so that it wasn't really going anywhere as a project. I was kind of fed up with it. Unfortunately, I managed to get a scholarship to study in the US for a year. So I had a Fulbright scholarship at Columbia University. And it was during that time where I was basically just looking around for a new project. I was sort of exploring various options. I stumbled really into kind of late 19th century intellectual history project that I ended up doing for my PhD. Institutionally, this could have been tricky in other institutions, switching from essentially a politics project to essentially a history project. But fortunately, it was a particular moment in Cambridge's disciplinary, I guess, development where the Centre for International Studies, which is where I was located, happened to actually be in the history faculty. So it actually turned out not to be very problematic to just switch into doing a history PhD. And that's what I ended up with. So PhD in history, working on late 19th century ideas about the British Empire. And that became my first book later on. On the back of that, I got a JRF, which is a multi-year postdoc in one of the Cambridge colleges. And that was followed by another postdoc, temporary teaching position, and then finally a kind of permanent or I guess tenured teaching position, which is where I've been ever since, with the exception just of a sabbatical, short sabbatical in the US again during one of the postdocs. So that's the kind of trajectory. I say in conventional in one sense. I've stayed in Britain for most of it with a bit of time in the US. Elite institutions, I guess, in London and Cambridge. Disciplinary wise, it's kind of veered around a little bit. My interests have certainly never entirely settled, and I've been very fortunate to work in institutional spaces that have been open to transgressing disciplinary boundaries, I guess, because there are certainly risks in doing that in lots of places. And so, yeah, I can only really say that I've been lucky, frankly, that I've been able to do what I've been able to do. over the years. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk about some of the ways that that might be possible, might not be possible in other contexts that I know a little bit about, and any other questions you might have about my own kind of experience.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. One of the things that I find very interesting in what you have just said is I also have the impression now that I have a lot of freedom inside my institution, but
Mm.
whenever, I put my feet outside it, especially if I try to participate in conferences and so on and so forth, to get my work published, that becomes a huge challenge.
Mm.
People expect me
Yeah.
to make it very clear, especially because I don't have a degree in political science or history, why I think I belong. So is that the kind of problem you think you had to face as well?
Um, I certainly run up against disciplinary boundary keeping in various ways. So I think that, so various students of mine whose work straddles either political theory and history or IR and political theory or various other aspects. I mean, one possible difference here is that international relations in Britain, at least, and this is different in the US, it's a bit like human geography. You can do an awful lot of stuff under its broad umbrella. So you have political theorists, you have statisticians, you have people doing cultural theory, you have people doing historical sociology. It's become, because it doesn't have a strong disciplinary core, it's become a space in which you can do quite a lot of different kinds of work. And so it's allowed for people with various interests to sort of shelter in a way that's sometimes a bit harder in more established traditional disciplines. So, for example, in Britain, I would say there are more people doing continental political theory in IR than there are in political theory as a sort of subfield. And the same could probably be said about people doing Marxist work, about politics more broadly. I think there's more in IR than there are in other sort of subfields or approaches. So I've definitely benefited from that. It was also just a matter of luck in terms of timing. So the time I began to do my PhD, which I started, I think, in 1999, 2000 or so, there was an increasing amount of interest amongst historians, amongst political theorists, amongst IR scholars in the history of ideas about international relations, empire, world order, and so on. A decade before, it would have been a much less receptive audience. And so I sort of managed to catch a wave, really, of work that was being done in that vein. And that of course, makes it easier to find an audience, to find interlocutors. You might still run into problems of individual journals or whatever, but there's a kind of ready-made scholarly community that you can go and find, even if it's not like straightforwardly apparent. And I can think of other kinds of work where that's been true, but it's not true for everyone, of course, because it could be that you're working in an area where there really aren't that many people around, or it's not, reached a moment of sort of critical mass in a field, and then it's just going to be harder. So that's the kind of positive side of the story in relation to IR. But it's also the case that I've had various articles rejected on the grounds that they don't fit into particular journals and that they're in the wrong field and so on. So, I mean, that issue never goes away. I mean, I've had that within the last 2 or 3 years. It's not really just a function of kind of seniority versus junior scholars and all the rest. There are quite strong gatekeeping norms in some journals in some fields. But there's always also, at least in my experience, people pushing back against that. So it can be just about knowing which journals to submit to under which particular editorial teams as to whether they're more or less open-minded to publish certain kinds of work. So, for example, for a few years, American Political Science Review has been pretty open to publishing work in on empire, race, quite radical work in many ways. Previous editorial team before that wasn't so open to it. Maybe in the future, other editorial teams won't be either. So it's not even just picking individual journals, it's editorial teams in journals and whether they're open-minded or not. Doesn't guarantee publication, of course, but just as to whether you'll get a fair shot in terms of submissions you might be making. So I've had that, but I mean, as I say, I've come across people who've had much harder time than I have navigating these kind of complex issues. So I'm very aware of the fact that I've both got a privileged kind of academic position and that I've also been very lucky in various respects, just in terms of timing, for example. So it can be tricky for sure.
So, Vic, go
Yeah, I was going to come with a question. It's sort of I mean, in some ways could be directed to both Araldo and Duncan. But I think one of the things, I think I completely agree with Duncan that there is this, once you start having a finger in two disciplines, in my case, and even working, you have gone from working in one department to another department.
Mm,
There are constraints. So even with the ref coming up and given everything I've published so far, it's a question of should it go to a history panel or should it go to a
mm,
you know, all that kind of stuff. But is there something quite freeing about it as well? So I mean, I think one of the things I always think about when I was exclusively doing history that I, you know, if you want to write a history of political thought, given how ref works and so on, there is this element of archival discovery, really sort of throwing yourself into documents. If you're doing global history or global political thought, doing stuff in vernacular languages, all that kind of stuff. But now I feel as though, okay, well, actually, if I want to submit something to political theory or a journal like that,
mm,
I can just write a history, you know, a theoretically kind of complex, rigorous history of political thought or political theory article without having to kind of fetishize archival discovery and all this kind of
mm,
stuff. And I found that really free. I feel
yeah.
that I can kind of sort of just attune myself to whatever I want at the time. And there are historians that do this. I mean, your work, Duncan, is very kind of, empirically driven. But I think of someone like Faisal Devji who works on, Indian intellectual.
Absolutely, yeah.
He doesn't feel the need to have 100 footnotes per chapter for all of this kind of stuff, and he writes amazing work. It's really, really important stuff, and
Mm,
it's influenced me a lot. But I suspect, being a historian and working in history departments, he's often got this sort of like, well, how much sitting in the archive in Pakistan have you been
yeah.
doing for this kind of thing? But have you kind of found that element of it, and you, Araldo, as well, kind of freeing as
Uh,
well?
Araldo, do you want to answer first?
No, I don't know. I really I mean, my dissertation was in philosophy at the Sorbonne, which is a very conservative institution for sure, but at the same time, for two reasons, it's very open to this kind of work. First, because philosophy in France is extremely interdisciplinary. So
Mm,
if Foucault counts as philosophy, well, if you rely on archival sources as well, it counts as philosophy. But the second thing is that when we receive our PhD in France, we can't actually apply for professorships. We need to go through a process called qualification, in which disciplinary committees decide whether we are able to teach or not in that field. And given the fact that there is basically no job in philosophy, it's usually expected that we try to be accepted by at least three different committees. So if your dissertation is not interdisciplinary, it's basically impossible to do so. But
mm,
I agree with you, and I was thinking about, Faisal and all this discussion about, yes, on the one hand, you have people who overemphasize the importance of archival discoveries, and I do think it's happening more and more in political theory as well. At least in my field, in discussions about civil disobedience, people usually are able to land publications in top journals because they have found, that King said something in this unpublished manuscript. But at the same time, I have the impression as well that, yes, sometimes in political theory journals, they expect us to over theorize things that perhaps it's not necessary to theorize. So many of
mm,
my mentors have told me, no, perhaps you need to add a few concepts here. Perhaps you need to coin a new concept here. That's something that perhaps my mentors in history don't expect me to do. Yeah, I don't know.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I wouldn't. I mean, history might be changing in some respects. Again, this is just going to vary massively across institutions and almost certainly across national academic cultures. I mean, historians, I think, still do have a focus on the archive, but I mean, Faisal's just been appointed to one of the top history chairs at Oxford, and so there's certainly openness to alternative approaches if they're considered to be widely kind of successful, interesting, conceptually fascinating. I mean, that might not have happened in another institution. I don't know. That's why it's hard to generalize of some of these things. Mine work, I don't think, is particularly archival. I mean, I do occasionally use archives. I use a lot of primary sources, but most of the primary sources are printed and pretty easily accessible. So yes, archives, but it's not really been super central part of my work. I'm not sure I've ever made a major archival discovery. Most of the archival work I've done backs up stuff, helps to elaborate stuff that I've gained from elsewhere. Obviously, there's some kinds of work for which archival research can be extremely illuminating, but I don't think that it always has to be front and center in historical work, particularly in kind of the kind of work that we might do, intellectual historical work, particularly if what you're interested in is public intellectual utterances. What goes on behind the scenes can be useful to elaborate in certain ways, but if what you're principally interested in is the arguments that were circulating in a public space, the archive isn't necessarily the obvious place to search, or at least the first place to. You look what's out there in print, what's out there in the media, what's out there in different, forms of communication. So it very much depends on the question I think you're interested in asking, the kinds of materials you're gonna go for. And again, I think there probably is a bit more freedom being in a politics department for that than possibly in a history department, where there are still lots of people that are heavily focused on the archive as the principal kind of claim to historical methodology.
Yeah, just to add one thing, perhaps one of the experiences I had in the past, especially teaching as, you know, as lecturer in Germany, which is the kind of job you have only for 6 months,
Mm.
it was easier. I mean, you can basically teach everything in history because you can write a history of everything. But
Yeah.
whenever I try to pitch, I don't know, a course for a political science department, then the question is, what's political about that? So
All right.
where is the focus on politics here? And that's another question that, yeah, I have been facing as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, but concerning teaching particularly in this case.
Yeah, I mean, huh, again, my answer will probably be the same as it's been to other ones. I really think it depends on the institution. I mean, in some British politics departments, I would say there's a fairly narrow understanding of what politics is, possibly not as narrow as in some US departments. In others, you could teach a cultural studies course. You could teach a course on Marxist social theory. You could teach, I mean, it really a very expansive understanding of what it is to study politics. And so there's again differences both between institutions and between national academic cultures here, I think. I've been again fortunate in that my department here, which is a relatively new department, I mean, Cambridge is obviously a very old university, but the politics department here is less than 20 years old. And it's got a pretty expansive sense of what can be taught as politics, and our recruitment reflects that. We have people with PhDs in anthropology, in various area studies programs, in history, and philosophy, and so on. So that then filters down to the teaching about there's no sort of strong norm about what must count as politics because everyone's been trained in the same academic systems, often coming from very different academic backgrounds, will invariably mean that pedagogy is understood in a maybe somewhat broader sense than in a more tightly focused disciplinary department. So obviously I've both benefited from that and found it extremely liberating at a certain level, particularly at masters here where we get more freedom of what we can teach. So last year I was teaching on architecture and politics, for example. I've taught on literature and kind of utopian tradition science fiction within the department and so on. And I'm aware that that's not possible everywhere, although there are plenty of other departments that would allow you to do this if the courses were designed in a, sufficiently interesting way.
Yeah, so Vic, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, it's. I think the academy is one thing. I was thinking also about the public sphere to a certain extent. I
Mm.
mean, I get the sense that in the UK, the way things are going anyway, maybe not historically, that one of those disciplines is developing more of a cachet amongst media circles, the sorts of people who might come and ask you to do an interview if something happens in India, and that kind of thing. And I'm starting to sense it with undergraduates as well, because I mean, one of the really interesting things of recruitment, Leicester, is I'd say over 50% of our undergraduates have done history at A level, but not politics.
Mm. Yeah.
And history at school has sort of put them off for whatever reason. And they've got, oh, politics is, I can still broadly study those sorts of things, but it's more contemporary or it's got more applicability. Whereas actually, the fact that I can quite easily teach on both sides of that divide,
Yeah.
and the students are broadly the same, shows that actually they're very, very similar subjects. But have you felt that there's been a change in the sorts of public perceptions of those two subjects?
It's a good question and a tough one. I mean, I get a sense that historically, or at least within the last, say, half century or more, history's had higher cachet in the public in Britain than pretty much any of the social sciences, disproportionately so, far more so than in the US, for example. And so there are lots of high-profile public historians, and the book reviews and the major broadsheets are often going to be of history texts and so on. The most popular podcasts, the most goes on and on and on. So, and I don't see a decline in that. I still think there's a significant kind of public sphere presence for historians. I do think, and this is potentially a generational thing, that there is a greater both appetite and audience for politics scholars to reach out to a wider audience. I mean, there's always been people doing kind of election survey stuff, commenting on polling and all that kind of thing. But in terms of, say, publishing trade books, very political theorists hardly ever used to do that. It's becoming more
Mhm.
common. I remember about 10, 15 years ago when graduate students started publishing quite a lot in, the Boston Review, say, or Dissent or The Nation. It became amongst political theorists in the kind of circles that I'd been teaching or moving, something that was not that unusual. Whereas when I did my PhD, I didn't think I'd know anyone that did that kind of thing. So I think it's partly tied to seeking out alternative job routes,
Mhm.
worries about precarity being more and more intense over time, keeping options open. Also to do with changes in the nature of the publishing industry itself. There's a kind of explosion or a renewed interest in small, magazine type outlets and as well as some of the bigger ones. So various factors went into this. But I do think that politics scholars, and particularly I'm talking about political theorists here in the UK, are beginning to reach out more and have more of an audience than
Mhm.
at any time in the past. I mean, by far the most successful at this recently, of course, Leia Upi with her book Free, which became a global bestseller and is sort of sui generis. So it's not the kind of book that other politics scholars are necessarily writing. But I know quite a few people, and not just in my own department, but in other departments too, who are now writing for trade presses or are trying to at least reach a bigger audience.
Mhm. And I guess podcasting's probably helped. I mean, I'm thinking of David Runciman's sort of
Yeah. Yeah, no,
huge,
absolutely. Yeah.
huge reach now. But yeah, but then, yeah, it's true. I think it's that ability to make theory sort of accessible as well. I mean, that I think politics scholars have probably missed a trick for quite a while in terms of just talking about in a Hobbes in a way that the average person can understand, because the average person can understand Hobbes because what he's arguing is pretty sort of commonsensical in some ways once you get
Mm,
into it. So
yeah.
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the reason I ask is because I think in India it's very much the other way, that history is only becoming. I mean, I always say this to students. It's interesting. You go to an Indian bookshop in India, there's no history section really. So what is history is bundled into politics, it's bundled into biography, it's bundled into all of this kind of stuff. And Indian popular history has only now become kind of popular because it's become really politicized because of sort of Hindu nationalist culture war and all this kind of stuff
Mm,
that's going on. So it's interesting. I get asked for I feel like I used to get asked more when I worked in the history department in the UK, but now I work in a politics department. I get more people from India emailing saying, "Can you write a review of this?" or blah 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 blah. So it's an interesting. I mean, it's sort of, I don't know which market I prefer, I suppose.
yeah.
But I think probably the UK, because I'm not really willing to get into screaming and shouting matches, which seems to be the thing that gets you noticed in India. But yeah, it's an interesting sort of space to find yourself in and navigate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's linked to various institutional developments. I've already mentioned things like the state of the job market on the one hand for more junior
Mhm.
scholars, but it's also obviously linked to wider political developments. Sort of sense of a crisis of democracy means that specialists on democracy are suddenly in much more demand to talk about the
Mhm.
nature of the beast, and many of them are political theorists. And so there's a sort of reaching out from broadcasters, publishers I'd say a higher level than I'd seen before
Mhm.
because of the very kind of fraught nature of the wider politics and the culture war stuff. Just again amplifies that,
Mhm.
feeds into it.
Yeah.
Great. Araldo, shall we open the? I mean,
No,
please, ask.
just
Go
a
on.
quick.
I'm just thinking we're monopolizing.
No, no, no. Yes.
Hmm.
In any
But
event, as I said in my email, whenever you want to jump in, or if you have any questions that you or too shy to ask, you can send it to me, you know, either anonymously or yeah. If you don't know how to use the chat, please let me know. No, I was just going to talk about, just to mention very quickly the fact that sometimes I have been working with trade publishing for a few years now, especially because I
Mm,
thought again that I would not get a job. So I had a
mm,
tutorial training and so on. And one of the things I realized is it's easier to sell history because people associate history with stories and
yeah,
with narrative and so on and so forth. So even for political theory, if you're able to frame your book as a kind of, novel of sort, it helps. And I
yeah,
think people really appreciate. And you see, I don't know how it is in the UK, but I have the impression it's similar somehow that people really consume these huge biographies here, right? So
mm,
like King's biography seems to have been a bestseller. It was like 1,000 pages. And so, yeah, sometimes I think I remember Melvin Rogers mentioning a few years ago, I think on social media, that whenever he's in the committees that, decide who should win a book prize, he realizes
Yeah,
that people think political theory doesn't matter. It's too complicated. People will never understand. But history is accessible. History helps
yeah,
people understand what's happening today and so on. Yeah.
yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of the politics stuff that gets published and is being commissioned for trade publishers over here, it's not super technical, either in the sense of philosophically technical or in the sense of, hardcore quant methods. It is often narrative, it's storytelling. That does definitely make a difference in the way that you can sell a project to editors. And yeah, it does mean that you're threading a needle in a way. It's like, I mean, it does probably exclude certain types of project from really getting off the ground because there isn't a perceived market for them from the editorial side. But there is at least something of a market for it now in a way that is less so, I'd say, a decade ago. But history remains the dominant form of trade non-fiction publishing over here as well, as I think it is in many places. Yeah.
So, any other questions for Duncan? There are a few people who will be arriving in a few minutes, but for those of you who are in the room, any questions? We don't want, as Vic said, to monopolize the conversation. We are just trying to avoid uncomfortable silences, which can be helpful. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer questions on either my own sort of experience and work, or just if you have sort of general questions about the relationship between these disciplines and how it might be worth trying to think about them. Yeah.
okay, perhaps in the meantime, I'll just tell you a story, Duncan, since we couldn't meet, I think, 2 years
Mm,
ago in Oxford. So in 2019 or in 2018, we're able, I and another grad student at Paris One, Marta de l'Aquila, to have funding to organize, a series of events with Kimberly Crenshaw in Paris.
hmm
And the second of these events was a kind of conference, 2 day or 3 day conference on critical race theory,
mm,
which became a huge scandal. Perhaps I imagine many of our colleagues didn't follow that, but what happened was that Charlie Hebdo did a
mm,
series of cartoons portraying people like Crenshaw, terrible things about race, and summarizing each one of the presentations. And Charles Mills was there. And
mm,
so the final day, we're having dinner with him, and he didn't have internet connection in his phone. He asked me for mine. He went to Amazon and he found the cover of his book, and he showed, look, these two, and it was Locke and Kant, and he said, these are my boys. And that was precisely when he mentioned that you were a very good partner in works about race, but
mm,
also he mentioned, the ways in which it was interesting for him to see the ways in which people in our fields were more and more engaging with the critical philosophy of race he was trying to
yeah,
produce for decades, and nobody paid attention to, neither inside philosophy or outside. So my
yeah.
curiosity as a philosopher is, so how do you feel about engaging with philosophical work as the kind of work Mills was producing, especially because he was talking about
Yeah.
IR, right, in many of his.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm a big fan of his work, and I mean, I met him through organising a conference here, which resulted in an edited book on empire, race, and global justice, which came out a few years ago. So it was great to get to meet him because obviously he sadly died fairly recently. Big loss to the political philosophy world. He said at the time, and he said in various other places, that he thought that he had a more receptive audience outside philosophy often than inside philosophy. And I think, there are ways that can be explained. I mean, one of them in IR, I don't think he found much of an audience in American IR, for example, a kind of neo-positivist social science work that predominates there is just not going to be that interested in political philosophy, full stop, let alone forms of political philosophy which are much more challenging around questions of race and so on. But in IR in Britain, there's a lot of people work on questions of empires or post-colonial theorists as a receptive audience, and so Mills was one of a group of thinkers whose work landed quite quite early and quite hard and helped to shape various debates, probably before it did in political philosophy over here. I do think there's a generational shift in political philosophy and mainstream sort of analytic political philosophy. I think there's considerably more openness now to work coming from elsewhere within philosophy, including critical philosophy of race, but also work outside. So I'm, at least, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think compared to 20, 25 years ago, there's considerable more variety on display. And at least, I can think of a critical mass of people in this country and elsewhere working on questions of empire and its legacies, questions of racial inequality and domination, and so on. And that's reflected in publications, in teaching, in people who are being appointed to positions, often in leading universities who are going to then help train students. And so I'm sure there's a lot more work to be done. And I still think philosophy probably is more gatekeepy around some of these issues than maybe some other fields. But I would certainly say there's a story of progress there. And Charles, I think, was in many ways the key or one of the key players in opening up that, because of course he wrote in an analytic idiom. So even though his message was very challenging for a lot of mainstream political philosophers, he spoke their language. It's much easier to ignore or to dismiss positions which are just written in a different idiom, or sort of ships passing in the night. But when the engagement is from people that are very seriously trained in the intellectual discipline in which you are, it's harder to escape, and it's also going to attract more converts to the position. It's going to appeal more to people who are trained in that and are looking for new approaches, looking for alternative perspectives. So I think he was an absolutely key bridge figure in taking sort of anti-colonial traditions, anti-racist kind of work into analytic philosophy. Certainly not the only one, but really pioneering in terms of doing that. Yeah. And political theory more broadly outside philosophy departments, again, and it tends to be a bit more open to alternative approaches. In the US, there's a much more critical theory, much more historical work. And so I think that kind of approach, again, hit a bit earlier and probably had a slightly wider resonance. And I think that continues to be the case. So, yeah, different fields, different disciplines are open at different times to certain kinds of things. And a lot of it's about intellectual formation. There's obviously about authority structures within them and all the rest. But overall, I mean, the picture now, I think, is considerably better than it was a couple of decades ago and more. Which is not to say that it's ideal by any means, but there is, at least in the kind of circles I'm moving, much more work being done in these kind of areas and much more openness to some of these approaches than there was.
So Anna Maria, please go ahead.
Yeah, hello, and thank you very much for creating this space for discussion. I'm not sure, I mean, I'm gonna try to be like as clear as possible, but I'm not sure the question is clear in my head. I was wondering, because obviously I also work between history, especially with feminist histories of the beginning of the 20th century on paid domestic work and political theory. And the challenge that I have had has been to, so the problem with political theory and paid domestic work is that the discussions about paid domestic work, they are being had in sociology, history, anthropology. There have been some debates like wages for housework or social reproduction theory, but they're mainly led by sociologists, so who have also like who do empirical work and then they theorize it, and care theory. But for example, for me, like my approach has been very historical because I think that working with mobilizations by domestic workers has more theoretical potential that, I mean, or is complementary, but with like other theoretical frameworks. And the challenge with political theory, I mean, I am in political theory, is that, well, I think that I can say something about paid domestic work. The challenge, and I mean, the discussions that we've been having with my supervisor has been whether it fits or not political theory and whether it does make a contribution to the discipline. So, and I think that maybe now I have a way of doing that. I'm not sure if it's going to work or how it is going to be received, but that kind of question in when you do not really fit into discussions in political theory or questions. I mean,
Yeah.
the classical questions and concepts that are being discussed, and the discussions happen elsewhere. So that kind of, I don't know, I mean, it's not very clear, the question, but yeah, when, for example, like you work on something like pay domestic work, which political theories don't necessarily, I mean, the
Yeah.
more classical political theories don't really engage with. And also because, for example, the texts I work on are domestic workers texts from the beginning of the 20th century. There are these very interesting, like, feminist journals of the time. So, and I do believe that these texts are very, very theoretical, but obviously they don't necessarily match the language and the
Yeah.
kind of concepts political theorists work with. So, yeah, I don't know if any of you has something to say about that kind of problem.
I mean, I think the issue is a relatively familiar one in the sense that not so much the particular topic you're working on, but that sort of question of how to make historical materials, particularly when the historical materials are not canonical texts. They're public intellectual utterances, they're manifestos, they're manuals of various kinds, they're novels, they're non-traditional in terms of philosophical argumentation. How to convert that into arguments in political theory, and there's no straightforward answer. I mean, one mistake I think is to try and do it all in one article. You could kind of pull some of this stuff apart and publish or try and publish in a history journal, a more historically oriented piece, particularly a history journal. It might be an intellectual history journal or a journal that's open to kind of cultural and intellectual history, and then try and make a more theoretical argument and aim it at a political theory journal. Because there is a literature, Katrina Forrester's got a recent piece in APSR, as I'm sure you know, on wages for housework. There is a small political theory discussion around that very topic. So the way you frame the article is to kind of link it into that existing literature and then, add your contribution to it, some reworking of the history of it or some concept that you've derived from, activism in the previous period. So a lot of it's about the framing of the argument. There is a literature, even if it's a small one, that gives you enough to begin to make the move in a political theory article. But not everything has to go in a single article. And say some pieces are just more historical and are just going to be a harder sell for a politics audience. In my own work, I mean, those are the kind of pieces that I would often submit to a history journal. You've got to think about applying for jobs afterwards, so you don't want to end up with a politics PhD and only a history article or two. But if you've got a journal in an article in a history journal and an article in a politics journal, you can make the case that you're doing historically informed politics and political theory, and you're going to potentially reach a larger audience in different disciplines by kind of dividing up the work a bit like that. So I think sometimes people end up making it overly complicated by trying to make sure everything goes in, that it's like all the archival stuff is in there, but it's also making a really hardcore theoretical argument. And it's also, you can kind of pull it apart a little bit and frame the pieces slightly differently depending on where the emphasis is going to lie and what you want to do with it. That would be my kind of practical suggestion. Obviously, when you're writing a book on the basis, it's a bit more straightforward because you've got scope across different chapters to do different things and so on. But I also think, just to step back, that there's an increasing amount of interest in forms of political theory that are grounded in practice. I think there's less interest now in super abstract forms of political theory. The so-called ethnographic turn or ethnographic sensibility, defended in work by people like Bernardo Zacca, working on architecture, working on ethnographic methods being imported into political theory is just one instance of that. He argues that that can be employed historically as well. His current ongoing project is looking at welfare offices going back to the late 19th century in the US, in Denmark, and in Britain, drawing on lots of different historical materials, different interdisciplinary kind of sources, and trying to make both historical and theoretical arguments about the nature of the relationship between space and architecture and politics. So that's just to give one example. But I think that there is an opening now. People have always done this kind of work, but there's more discussion around it now, more recognition that this kind of work is a very valuable way of doing things. I've supervised 2 or 3 PhDs that doing people participant observation, ethnographic work, quite substantial empirical components, but ultimately to make theoretical contributions of one kind or another. So it's a good time to be doing that kind of work. But I sympathize with the difficulty of the practical difficulty almost of how to mold and shape and then submit work in these kind of veins. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that would be my sort of practical thought.
Yeah. No, definitely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was thinking, Duncan, listening to you now on certain journals that curiously, or I don't know why, even both political scientists and historians seem to um, recognize as journals where
Yeah.
people in both fields can publish, get tenure
Yeah.
or position. One of them is curiously, okay, for those of us who work in modern in intellectual history, places like modern intellectual history, the
Yeah.
Journal of the History of Ideas are wonderful. Sometimes I have the impression that even some political scientists can appreciate the fact that you have published, I don't know, in the historical journal.
Yeah.
Are there any
Yeah.
journals that you think that read well across both fields from
I mean, the
your
ones you mentioned are in many ways. So if you're doing history of political thought, there's a fair number of history journals that are going to be recognizable to other historians of political thought. Journal of History of Ideas, Modern Intellectual History, probably the most, I guess, high profile of those, but Global Intellectual History, History of European Ideas, Intellectual History Review would all be examples of that. And then there are some general history journals, of which the Historical Journal is a good example, which are open to and regularly publish history of political thought. So again, I mean, publishing in those is, as long as you also publish in politics journals, it is a positive sign for a lot of people. It shows that you can, as it were, speak both disciplinary languages, that you can reach an audience outside it. I mean, history of political thought is an interdisciplinary field, in the sense that it crosses both history and politics, but also people in language departments work on it, and some people in philosophy do it. So it doesn't have to just be in disciplinary journals. I say the only problem is if you publish only outside the discipline that you then apply for jobs in. That does give a kind of somewhat incoherent intellectual profile. But if you've got two articles and one's in a politics journal, one's in a history journal, at least in the institutional context I work in, that would be considered to be fine. So and it can make it a bit easier to frame the kind of work you're doing, because some of it, not all of it's going to be generating new concepts or pulling out new things. Some of it is making a contribution that's principally historical, that the debates it's contributing to are maybe principally amongst historians, and other bits you can do more with conceptually, do more with in terms of political theory debates. So yeah, that's the way I think about it. And the same with people that are working across IR and political theory, or IR and history, other combinations that a number of my own graduate students work on. It can be about, yeah, splitting the difference. Also, of course, gives you a wider range of job options in terms of which kind of jobs you can apply for. Because that is worth thinking about. Obviously, if you're at the beginning of your career and don't have kind of regular employment, as to where the jobs, if if any, actually are in the market at the time. At least in this country, in Britain, that is, there are generally more jobs in politics departments and history departments at the moment. So there are strategic questions or tactical questions that are very much ones worth taking seriously, as well as the kind of straight intellectual questions about where the best kind of intellectual fit is. You know, what helps the most in terms of what you want to do next as a step in your career.
Yeah, I was also thinking about, for sure, I think especially in political science and history, especially in very traditional departments, publishing very specific journals is
Mm.
key. And I still
Hmm.
have the impression that, and again, Anna Maria, trying to address your question, I have the impression that people also appreciate when you're able to place your work in journals in, I don't know, Black studies, feminist studies, and so on, where you have much more, I don't know, possibilities of being interdisciplinary vis-a-vis
Mm.
or traditional journals, I would say. I think in Black studies, I don't know, for example, souls, the Black scholar are
Yeah,
places that people appreciate as, okay, it shows that they are contributing actually
yeah,
to the field, to another field perhaps. Yeah.
yeah. No,
This
I
one,
think
yes, go, sorry.
Yeah, no, so I think that's right. The only issue is just about the number of publications, as it were. So if you only got time and energy and space to do one piece, it makes sense to go for a kind of mainline, high-profile journal that's got a potentially general audience. So if you're in political theory, a journal, say like political theory, or if you're in intellectual historian, modern intellectual history, or journal of history of ideas, or whatever. But if you've got two or three pieces, and you're say working in Black Studies, then also then publishing in a more kind of subfield or thematic journal can send a strong signal that you've also got this audience here. You're also publishing in that way. Same if you're doing feminist political theory, publishing something like feminist theory, do the same kind of thing. In my case, it was published in a imperial history journal, say. So obviously working on intellectual history of empire, but I could also then try and publish something in an actual imperial history journal, not an intellectual history journal. So depending on the themes you're working on, the particular journals are going to differ. But the danger in my, if I'd have only done that and then applied for politics jobs, people would be sort of saying, well, why don't you, apply for history jobs? Don't apply for it here. But the fact that I also had politics ones plus those history ones, and people whose CVs we look at, people are applying for things. It's a strong signal that you can publish to these various audiences, to these various fields, as long as you've got a intellectual identity that you can narrate in your cover letters, in your presentations about the type of work you're doing, why it fits within a particular field, even if you're speaking to people in related fields, cognate fields. So crafting that sort of sense of that intellectual identity, that narrative that it puts the pieces together, it is kind of an important part of this. Publication is not the only thing, but sadly, because I don't think it's a good thing, publication is a very strong signal on job markets for postdocs, for assistant professorships, lectureships, and so on. Much more so again than it used to be. There's a kind of arms race has developed as fewer and fewer jobs and more students going for them. That publications, again, at least in the academic job markets that I know, are just so central nowadays. It's really worth thinking hard about this, and relatively early in the PhD process. You don't want to leave it till the end of the PhD when the timelines don't match up very well.
Yeah, perhaps a related question still following up, Ana Maria. What do you think? You mentioned, Duncan, the ways in which sometimes you have more freedom when you're writing a book in contrast to the individual
Yeah.
articles. They eventually become chapters of the book. So what has been your experience with academic publishers? Are they usually open to this kind of interdisciplinary discussions we are having, or do you think the same kind of disciplinary boundaries we can see in journals
Yeah.
are reproduced by academic publishers, book publishers as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think there's a bit more freedom with books. Partly it's just the length of a book, but partly also, I mean, some journals are more open than others to interdisciplinary work, but also to experimentation in terms of the way you present work, terms of your sort of your language, your style, and so on. But in general, journals are, I think, a bit more constraining, and especially once you've been through a review process with multiple reviewers and often had to incorporate their reviews and can kind of dilute the argument you want to make, or there's endless memes out there on social media about the version that ends up being published as opposed to the version you put in because you've tried to respond to reviewer one and reviewer two and reviewer three and so on. And there's an element of that in publishing books, but in my experience is less. And that's because if they tend to be interested in the project in the first place, there's a little bit more freedom with what then goes into the product. With journals, especially the top journals, the rejection's done at the kind of submission stage generally, and so most pieces get rejected and move on. Whereas with books, I mean, you can get rejected at the editorial stage, but once they've expressed an interest in the project, it's a higher probability that it ends up being published. And that generally, especially if you've got a decent editor, there generally is scope for letting you have a bit more creativity and a bit more freedom in the way that you do things. And that's particularly going to be true the more senior you get. Of course, for junior people, it's right, there are probably more hoops to jump through, maybe a bit more expectation about a standard first book. But if you are, 2, 3, 4 books under your belt, there's usually considerably more freedom. That's why quite a lot of senior scholars don't publish many journal articles, because the process of going through journal publishing, as I'm sure most of you, maybe all of you know, can be extremely frustrating. You can run and very time consuming. It's important to get the job, it's important to get tenure, but once you've done that, the incentives for continuing to publish articles are very different. And some people keep doing it because they like doing it, and journal articles do tend to probably get read more than many books because they're shorter and more easily accessible. But a lot of people just stop trying to jump through those hoops, particularly in history, in my experience. A lot of people stop publishing with academic publishers. They publish trade books, and those books are regarded as serious pieces of scholarship in history. And so, again, there are some different disciplinary norms there. It's harder to do that in politics, although it's beginning to open up a bit. But yeah, journal publishing is a weird thing, as I'm sure you've come across in many ways. It's both necessary, particularly at the beginning of the career, to tick various boxes, but it can be extremely constraining, both because of the expectations of the journals themselves, the expectations of the reviewers that you have to get through, but also just the length, the format. Luckily, journals have opened that up a bit in recent years. It used to be the case that most journals were kind of 8 to 9,000 words, including footnotes, which for history pieces in particular is really very small. Nowadays, most journals have lengthened the word length, which is useful. But yeah, books, in my experience, there is a bit more freedom. Same, funnily enough, with edited book chapters, which generally people are not strongly recommended to do so much at the beginning of their career because articles count for more. But I mean, I've edited quite a lot of books, and some of the most interesting bits of work that I've published through as being an editor, as it were, have been in those kind of things. Because again, there's less of a constraint. There's not such a sort of fine-tuned reviewer process that's insisting on degrees of homogeneity in terms of style and expression and so on. So again, there's certain publishing formats that have a bit more freedom and creativity. But the big proviso is that you've got to be careful in terms of the career stage at which you do this, because there are these expectations early in a career for getting the job, for getting tenure, that you've got to be careful to kind of to meet, and it can be extremely frustrating.
Yeah, any more questions for Duncan? Again, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. Um, no one? You can use the chat. So, in the meantime, Duncan, I have a few questions. Some of them were sent via email. One of them was,
Yep.
I think you partially answered the question throughout the conversation, but it was about what kind of advice you usually have for your own students when
Yeah.
it comes to navigating a job market where they can eventually pitch themselves as either historians and or
Mm.
political theorists or
Yeah.
scientists.
Yeah, I mean, so I've probably given scattered through my comments the various bits of advice I would give to that, but it's worth reiterating them. But I'd start by saying I think it's, at least in the UK, I don't want to speak for other national contexts because it may vary, but in the UK and to some extent in the US, it's easier to get a job in a politics department as an historian of political thought with a history PhD, say, than vice versa. History departments, in my experience, have been less willing to hire people with politics PhDs, even if the work is historical. I can think of exceptions, so I don't want to suggest it never happens, but I think, to put it another way, history is slightly more gatekeeping as a field in terms of the training involved. Just like philosophy is, it's very hard to get a philosophy job if you don't have a philosophy PhD. But philosophy PhDs are regularly hired in politics departments in Britain doing political philosophy. So there are some people that go the other way, but the traffic isn't always equal. So that's the first thing to think about is what's your PhD in? What discipline, department are you actually in when you're thinking about likely job options? Because you really want to prioritize the discipline where you have the best chance of being hired. You don't want to put a lot of effort into crafting an intellectual identity that's not really going to be recognized or has got less chance of being recognized in a different discipline. So that's the first question. That may vary between different countries. Then it's a matter of publication, principally. So the strongest or most straightforward signal for applying for a history job, if you don't have a history PhD, is to have published in a history journal and a recognizable history journal. Obviously, the project itself has to be an historical one and so on. So that's significant. That kind of crafting an intellectual narrative or identity that I mentioned, which is going to contain various parts. It's going to be partly about your research, and that itself is going to then link to the research, to the publications, but it's going to be partly about your teaching. What have you been teaching? What can you teach realistically? What can you offer to teach to a department? It's going to be about what conferences you attend, who your interlocutors are. So doing it for two fields it's harder, right, than doing it for one field. It requires more labor, it requires more time. It can be done, but it would mean trying to publish in history and publish in political theory, or publish in international relations and publish in politics. Political theory, if you're doing that other interface, it would mean maybe going to a history conference, or at least a conference where historians go. It could be a general kind of intellectual history conference or whatever, as well as, say, going to APSA or WPSA or whatever it might be. It means that you can teach across the kind of courses that are in history departments, as well as the kind of courses that historians of political thought would teach. So certainly not impossible, but it's more straightforward if you're, as it were, ensconced within a single discipline, which is why interdisciplinarity is intellectually very exciting. People like it. People proclaim it as being central to everything they do, but then disciplines are the things that hire. So people speak the language of interdisciplinarity, and then they hire in disciplines. Once you're in a discipline, and once you have tenure in the US type system, or once you've got a permanent job in a kind of UK type system, then you've got a lot of freedom to basically do what you want to do intellectually. You can begin to craft your communities wherever you want, essentially. You don't have to jump through those steps that are expected of you anymore. So that's why there is considerably more freedom intellectually at certain career stages than others. But at the beginning of the career, you need to be able to get the post, get a job, get settled and established, and that does require sending these kind of various signals through publications, through what you've been teaching and so on, that will basically mean that you're the kind of person that a department's going to hire because I think you can contribute to the field of the department. Yeah.
Yeah, we still have 10 minutes. Please jump in if you have a question. I have another one that was sent via email, which is, what do you think? Oh, go ahead, Ana Maria. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just
Yeah,
going to plug my
actually,
computer in. Let me just have 10 seconds. I've just got my
yeah, sure,
alarm has gone off saying the computer's about to run out of battery.
sure.
Very informal intermezzo as well. Where are you
Sorry.
based? No, I was just saying it's a very informal intermezzo. And I was going to ask you, Ana Maria, where are you based?
So my university is also in Paris, is at Sciences Po. I mean, also with respect, because I know you did your PhD at Sorbonne.
Oh, I do think that years
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm
ago,
back.
I taught at Sciences Po political science for almost 6 years. And I think it was
Oh,
really
wow.
helpful to help me become someone that was visible in political science as well. Being
Okay.
being a TA for Introduction to Political Science to Introduction to Political Theory. So I was at Sciences Po. I was teaching most of the time in France. So yes.
Yeah, me too. I taught there. Yeah.
So go ahead, sorry.
No, but also because Sciences Po is maybe one of the 2, 3 places where you can teach political theory in France. So,
That's a very
um,
provocative statement. Yeah.
yeah. No, but because I mean, I think as a discipline, political theory it's mainly because there are not many masters except for Paris 8 and Sciences Po. They don't hire people in political theory. So it's, I mean, for the whole disciplinary. But I wanted to jump in on what you just said, Duncan, in the sense of like what, because obviously, ideally, yes, you would be able to be in like history and like to have like a convincing profile, like in like multiple disciplines. But then, I mean, at least like the difficulty that I see is that I read a lot of sociology, I read a lot of history, I read a lot of political theory. But then, obviously, when you read a lot across disciplines and when the project is interdisciplinary, you have to lose out. You lose out on like the specificity that you can have in a certain disciplines. You might lose also on the canonical authors in the different disciplines. Like, for example, I was seeing a lecturer position that was like, yeah, like ancient philosophy. And I was like, yeah, I mean, obviously I could teach because we all teach things that we are not an expert on,
Yeah.
but it's kind of far away. So, and at some point you also have to prioritize, and it's difficult to have like a
Yeah.
convincing profile, right? Like in multiple disciplines, like you obviously you do your best to like not get it like completely wrong and to but like I do feel, for example, oh, if I were only in one field, I would have like objectively more time just to
Yeah.
know more about that and about
Mhm.
like the authors in that discipline. While because I go through all of these disciplines, probably I get a better understanding of like the subject by domestic work and how
Mm.
differently and what language and with what conceptions people work. But like I do lose in terms of like the kind of, for example,
Yeah.
debates that are in political theory. So um yeah, so
Yeah,
how
it's hard.
prioritize?
Um, how do well, yeah, basically you prioritize the thing which well, it's going to be the intersection of what you really want, what your preference is in terms of would you want to be in a politics department above all, and also what practically is the most realistic. And that's going to be a combination of, again, where are you already? If you're in a politics department, that is going to be easier to craft an identity as a politics scholar than if you're in a history department. It's not impossible to do the other thing, but it's more straightforward if you're in it. So it's a sort of triangulation of the way that you can present the most convincing scholarly identity, essentially. I definitely wouldn't try and present yourself as belonging to more than, or at least as applying for jobs in more than two disciplines. Some people can do it more than that, but it's really hard once you're thinking sociology, history, politics, because sociologists will look at an application like that and say, well, this person is not really a sociologist because they're not trained in sociology. That's not their main focus. The historian will look at the same. And so, you know, and it depends what kind of work you're doing because you're working on the edge of history and political theory. That's why you can potentially pitch yourself as both, but only those two. And it might be that ultimately only one makes sense, that politics is the thing you do, and you say you do a historically informed form of politics. And yes, it involves in a research kind of capacity doing interdisciplinary work. But doing interdisciplinary work doesn't mean that you don't frame your project as principally contributing to a single discipline, to politics, right? You do that through interdisciplinary research, but your principal framing is as a contribution to political theory, history of political thought. And then that's the way you pick your interlocutors, who are your primary authors you're engaging with in contemporary debates, what sort of arguments you want to make, rather than trying to say, this is my contribution to sociology, this is my contribution to history, this is my contribution to politics. You may be doing all those things, but you have to choose. You have to choose which your primary audience academically for that kind of work. That's the framing issue. And that's going to be true when you then write up an article. If you're going to send it to a politics journal, the framing will be somewhat different from if you submit it to a history journal. So, yeah, that's the way I would think about it. Now, it might be in France there are more jobs in sociology than in politics, in which case that might be the way you would think about that. So that's why I'm saying there's going to be variety across different academic cultures, but you don't want to spread yourself too thinly in the way you present yourself. That's different from doing interdisciplinary research. They're working at different levels. One is, I mean, a lot of people's projects are interdisciplinary in one way or another, whether the disciplines are history and politics, or philosophy and politics, or empirical political science and political theory. But you can do the research that is involving all kinds of debates and discourses and fields. But at a certain point, you make the decision about how to frame your contribution. And for the framing, then that has to be about one or two fields, subfields. And that's the way you kind of narrow it down and tell the story you want to tell, reach out to the audiences you want to reach, rather than simultaneously trying to talk to all the disciplines that are fed into the research itself, because that becomes unmanageable.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So perhaps the final question or the question I have received.
Yeah.
Anyone here in the room perhaps wants to jump in? If not, the final question, Duncan, is what do you think about what still needs to be done in the scholarship about the political theory of imperialism, empire, colonialism, and so on? What needs to be done?
What needs to be I mean, that's a big question. Yeah, a very good question. Not least because, in a way, my own work has moved out of that kind of set of debates in recent years. My current research is much more on 20th century ideas about science and technology. So I'm not going to claim to be at the sort of cutting edge of those debates. I mean, the main development as it was happening across the time I was working on it, and I think this is just going to continue, is more and more work on global political thought or comparative political thought, or whatever terminology we want to use. That's, to me, one of the most vibrant areas in political theory and in intellectual history, and I think that's just going to continue as a major trend. At a theoretical level, I mean, more on the integration probably between political economy and history of ideas about empire would be one. There's a huge number of research questions could be generated, but I think a lot of the most exciting work or most interesting work that I've seen really has been about, I guess, expanding the geographical scope, much more so than was the case, 2, 3 decades ago. So building on work that's been done often by people in other disciplines, in area studies disciplines and language disciplines, and bringing it into political theory and then giving it a kind of new set of debates, interlocutors, and reinforcing those essentially debates about the nature of empire, about the intersection of empire and race, and so on. But I mean, other people can have different answers to that. That's my sense of one of the directions of travel in the field.
Okay, so first of all, my apologies again for the confusion considering the meeting time.
No worries, don't worry about it at all.
Thank you very much again, Duncan, for accepting to talk with us. I will make, the video available probably on YouTube and send a link to everyone who registered for the event and could not come. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon, hopefully in
Yeah,
person.
it'd be great to see you. Thanks everyone for coming, and goodbye. Yeah, cheers. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.